Well, good afternoon again. I am thrilled to be introducing our legislative policy panel members. We have Dr. Brian Sponsler, Dr. Shelagh Gallagher, and Dr. Julia Link Roberts. Thank you so much for being with us, and I'm going to hand the floor off to you.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and appreciate the opportunity to connect with the conference, and I'm super excited to be joined by two exciting panelists here for a conversation about legislative policy and the ways in which legislative policy action can support gifted and talented students. We have a few questions that can guide our conversation, but I certainly hope that we can do more than play ping pong with just a question and then an answer and have a little bit more of a discussion. I'm very excited to hear from our experts and contribute some perspectives from the work I've been doing at Education Commission of the State. So, I think where the last panel ended is an appropriate pass off and a good place to start when we talk about ways to engage the policy process, and particularly the legislative policy process, and thinking about ways in which state policy in particular can be shaped to support this important student population. And so, Shelagh, maybe I'll start with you with the first question and just sort of get our conversation kicked off. But, when we think about the tension between the education policy changes that I think many of us believe need to be made, some of those are grounded at a district level, some at an individual school level. Certainly there's a role for the federal government here to play. But when we think specifically about the state role and changes that we might desire to see put in place to support gifted education broadly, there's a tension between sort of those changes the advocacy community would desire and some of the changes we see put in practice. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your experiences and observations in that tension between what we get out of the policymaking process versus the ideal standards we might have going into it. And I'd welcome a little conversation between you, myself, and Julie about this.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to Norma and to Joy and Jessica and everybody who's been involved. What a great event this has been. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start this PowerPoint slide because I'm afraid I'm just entirely codependent with my slides. And when I started thinking about the answer to this question, I thought about a couple of things. The first piece being the challenges with legislation itself and the practices of legislation, especially around gifted education today. And on the other side, the gifted educators and what we're doing to prepare for legislation, how we think about ourselves, how we present ourselves to others as we get ready to think about engaging in legislative conversations. So that's where I want to start today. And of course, I can't do anything without going back to a source of a lot of my wisdom, which is my dad, James Gallagher. And I wanted to start with his definition of policy, because I think it's really important context for us. Policy, he said, was the means by which scarce resources are distributed across unlimited needs. And I think that's where a lot of legislators and administrators live. It's like there's never enough. And for us in gifted education, the question then becomes, how do we make our needs rise to the top of their priority list? I think some of the issues that challenge us in terms of the legislative side, what they prefer to fund and focus on, have three general areas, or at least three that we can start with. The first is the starting place. Where do they like to put their emphasis in handing out resources? The second is the duration of time they give us to make something meaningful of what we want to do. And then the third is whether or not they focus first on projects or on infrastructure. So you'll see in front of you here this cute little chart that demonstrates the deficit in reading skills and non-cognitive skills according to poverty level already in place in kindergarten. And you'll see that it's an enormous difference. This comes from the Economic Policy Institute. Less large in terms of the non-cognitive processes. But what I want to emphasize here is if we aren't starting in kindergarten, then we're starting too late. The more we learn about not just cognitive capacity, but the actual composition of the brain and the impact that poverty can have on that, the more you realize that we need to start in kindergarten. That's not always an easy sell to legislators, especially in gifted education, where a lot of experts in early childhood education would say it's too young to test, it's too young to provide services, we don't know what the child's about yet. The second is duration. We seem to be in a phase of 3-year projects, and anybody who's had a 3-year GEPSC project or a 3-year anything project will tell you that's not enough time to make a meaningful impact, certainly not enough time to implement systemic change. Now the GEPSC projects are 5 years, and that's much better, but you can barely get your feet on the ground in a 3-year project. So we need to start thinking longitudinally, especially for starting in kindergarten, like the Perry Preschool project, like the Abecedarian project. And then third, if we start with projects without first having an infrastructure, then there's no place for the product of those projects to go when they're done. And we've seen that a lot with the GEPSC projects, where a lot of good work seems to be fizzling out into the stratosphere because there's no home for it. And I would argue that we need to start with infrastructure first, but that tends to be a little more expensive, a little more change involved. And I think legislators can be leery of that. In terms of what we need to be doing in gifted education, I want to talk about, first of all, our need to find points of convergence with general education. And a lot of this came home to me when I had the opportunity to work with Betsy Jones at the Institute for Educational Advancement on a public opinion poll called America Agrees, where we polled 1,400 randomly or stratified random selection of American citizens on whether they understood what gifted education was and what they thought of it. We started by asking them what their priorities were about educational problems generally. And you'll see here a greatest hits list on the front: quality teachers, STEM, funding for low-income programs in low-income areas. Those are the 3 really pivotal issues. Gifted education, as you might expect, is at the bottom of the list, but it's still an issue for 57% of the public. Over 50% is a good thing in legislative issues. And it was, to be honest, higher than we expected it to be. And when we broke it down by income level and race and ethnic group, we found that more Hispanic and more Black respondents were in favor of gifted education, perhaps because it was a resource they lacked and wanted. But when it comes to points of convergence, I want to think about this in particular. We found that there was great support, huge levels of support for training any teacher working with gifted students and for funding in programs in underserved areas. So those points of convergence, which were also on the greatest hits list of educational problems they identified, those are areas where we need to be finding colleagues and working with others in order to create legislative opportunity. The other thing is that with that much popularity for some aspects of gifted education, we can stop playing defense and we can go on the offensive, I think, and present ourselves as though we've got a commodity that's highly valuable, not something that people want destroyed, but something that people want ubiquitously and fairly distributed across all populations. I'm going to run out of time before I can tell you about a story that we've been engaged in North Carolina, where we took this approach. We said, if we tell people what we want to do, certain groups outside of gifted education, but involved in the life of children of poverty and children of color, they're going to want to join with us and form a coalition to provide services for these kids and create change in the system generally. And the short form is, so far, we've been successful beyond our wildest dreams. So I'll stop there and hand it back.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. And let me let Julia jump in, but I love a couple of these slides and have some questions, some probing points we can maybe address a little bit, but I want to give Julia a chance to offer a similar kind of response. And from your perspective, Julia, what are some of the tensions we see in the the way in which gifted education plays out on legislative policy agendas. Maybe some of the components that were just mentioned here. I love the definition of applying scarce resources to unending problems as a good way to frame that, and certainly appreciate as a student of public policy your father's work. So thank you for starting us off with that. But Julie, maybe some of your thoughts in context, what we've already heard, and some of your own takes on this particular question. Oh, and I think you're on mute, Julie, if I could ask. Thank you.
When I think about the difference between what we would wish for and what we have in place, it takes me to thinking about advocacy and how do we get things in place that we really want. One of the things that we absolutely must do, state by state, is to look at the bills that are introduced in the legislature and not be surprised when something is passed that is detrimental to gifted kids or any kids learning at the level at which they're ready to learn. So we need to pay attention. We've got to be alert. And that doesn't require lots of folks doing that, but someone must be reading the bills to know what is being discussed. Many times a phrase in a bill will make a difference. For example, the use of the word of acceleration. It has been used for not to mean at all what gifted ed means by acceleration. And so clarifying the use of terms becomes very important. It also is very important to get to know legislators before you need them. And that's true of decision makers at the local level too. It's too late when the crisis is there to introduce yourself and to become acquainted with people. So you've got to know the process. Where is the decision going to be introduced that you're interested in? It isn't blanketing the whole legislature in order to get your idea started. Education bills start in the Education Committee. Budget bills start in the Budget Committee. And I must tell you that the leadership in the House and the Senate can make things go underground and never emerge. So it is very important to be tied in with the leadership in the houses. It is important to understand that all legislators are not equal, and that doesn't sound very good, but it's true. At least they're not equal in terms of the decision that you will be needing. Of course, everyone needs to know local legislators who represents them, but that may not be the person this year that's in the leadership position that makes things happen. And finally, who needs to know about gifted ed in the legislature? Who do you need to be talking to routinely, not once a year, not making only one visit one time, but who needs to be in an ongoing conversation with the people? And that doesn't mean daily, but that means that with some regularity, the needs of gifted students are being communicated to legislators who can make things happen.
Thanks for that, Julie. And I think there's a couple of threads here maybe we can hover on for a second. So, the question at Education Commission of the States, we're a state-based membership organization. We work with governors, and their education staffs, legislators, and agency staff across the range of education policy questions, from early learning through post-secondary and workforce. And a lot of these things are really resonating with the way we frame conversations about advocacy for all issues. I think the questions about sort of the origin of authority and which committees have that, which individuals have that, who has the ability to make change is really, really important. One of the things, Sheila, maybe I could ask you about is, so you talked about sort of the duration of projects and programs, and 3 to 5 years being sort of an optimal longer term window to get things built up and implement change. I'm struck by the that every 2 years, the political calendar has a disruption to the individuals and players that we're trying to deal with in state legislatures in particular. And I describe affectionately legislative bodies as places of people with high influence and low information, which most of them come to their work probably knowing very little about gifted education in general, let alone about the prior policy posture of their state. And so maybe you could each speak to sort of this question about how do you go about responding to sort of the political rhythms that are much shorter and have different incentive cycles built into them, with the necessity of some of the longer term, kind of planning and projects that go into place that provide the evidence to support future legislative activity. And so I'm curious whether either one of you have a anecdotal experience you could share with attendees here about how to sort of navigate that the players you need to focus on are finite and not in totality the legislature, as we just heard, but also those players change over time. And obviously the needs and the advocates for those needs are sometimes more durable than the legislators themselves. So any thoughts about kind of mapping the political calendar to the calendar of advocacy that's built on a foundation, that's much longer term than the nature of the legislators we're trying to influence?
Well, one of the things that we have done, we don't always do it in Kentucky, but we've done it over the years, and that is to have candidates for governor write out what do they believe and would they support in terms of gifted ed. When we were advocating for a residential school, we asked both candidates to tell us where they stood on that. And that made a whole lot of difference down the line.
I would say that our state affiliate has had a legislative liaison for a long time, and I think it's a very important role to have at each state affiliate group, because that way you can keep tabs on who is thinking what about gifted education at any given time. And you have somebody who can quickly get to the legislature if a bill is about to be passed. This can happen instantaneously. And if you're not boots on the ground, something could happen that makes things go amiss. And I've actually got a negative example of that to share. A few years ago, North Carolina revamped its gifted education legislation so that there were programs developed by individual counties, because we've got large urban districts like Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and we've got small counties like Perquimans, and they shouldn't necessarily have the same requirements for their gifted program. So there were local committees that developed their plan with the gifted coordinator leading the bunch. And then when it got to the idea was that these plans would then be turned over to the Department of Public Instruction and our state consultant, and they would be able to supervise and make corrections to anything that was not best practice. So if a committee in Perquimans came up with some wild idea, they had a supervisory role. Well, this was the era of local control. And so when it went through the legislature, they took that part out. So all our state consultant can do now is make comment on the plan. And the local school districts and the local school boards are free to decide whether they want to pay attention to those comments. And it has had a profound influence on the success of that legislature, and makes Snehaw's job a whole lot harder.
I appreciate that reminder. Nothing happens until it does in legislative sessions, and oftentimes that can be with very little notice. So I think there is a necessity for being vigilant on continuing to monitor and have somebody whose responsibility it is to think about these things on an ongoing basis. So lots of process questions we touched on here and can continue to come back to as we move forward. But I do want to talk a little bit about, as we engage this process, we think about legislative changes we've seen in different states, Kentucky, North Carolina. There may be other examples we could draw on. They're specifically designed to get at this question of sort of equity and how equity shows up and is operationalized in gifted education programs. Do you have some examples about maybe best practice or best design in legislative policy that we might hold up as examples of the places other places could consider, and where that process has worked to the advantage and benefit of the programs we've been advocating for? I don't know, Julie, if you may want to start us off on that one, and then we can.
I'd be glad to. Something we've done in Kentucky, and maybe not done as well as we could, but I think it is a wonderful piece of legislation that we have, and that is to establish the primary talent pool so that for children in K1, 2, 3, approximately a quarter of the children would receive, they're not identified, but they're selected for the talent pool, and they should be receiving multiple opportunities, maybe some like Ann Robinson talked about today with novelty, but to develop their thinking skills and to enhance their interests during that time, so that children from poverty and children with more limited opportunities have every chance to develop and to then be identified later for areas of giftedness. I think it is a marvelous plan because we know early matters in the development of children. And since this is the beginning of school for most children, I think the primary talent pool is an excellent idea. But please know, I didn't say we're doing it incredibly well, but it has the potential to be done and enhance learning for lots of children.
Thank you, Julie. That's a great example. Sheila, do you have some others you want to share?
I think what I'd like to do is share with you an example of what happens in the legislative process when we talk about trying to put best practice into place. I have this other example here from the North Carolina's new math legislation. They were talking about this a little in the panel last night, where students who score high on the accountability test are automatically qualified for advanced services in a subject area. And Jonathan last night talked about, let me get this started. Jonathan talked about the initial legislation, and he talked about the regulations and how important the regulations are, because that's where the rubber hits the road. But there's a period in between, which is also really important, which is the markup, and the place where the public gets to make comment. When our math legislation first came to us, and it sort of came to us out of the blue, it said that any student scoring a 5 on the end of grade math test, which is the highest level, shall be identified as academically or intellectually gifted, and they qualify for placement. Not only do they qualify for placement, but they can take precedent over a child with great capacity who scored a 4. So there were a couple of red flags in this for us, that the child would be identified as academically or intellectually gifted and qualify for any services, which to us meant also English language arts was a problem. That they could take the place of a child who showed high potential was also a problem. And then when it all went out to markup and we had our say and other people had their say, it translated into something like this: when practicable. That in itself is an escape clause. Local boards of education will offer advanced learning opportunities for grades 3 through 5 and advanced courses to grades 6 and higher. So they're differentiating between what happens in elementary and what happens in secondary. What happens in elementary only has to match what it happens in the grade level. So again, Julia's point about language being so important, this seems to exclude acceleration since that's a grade higher for those kids. And then advanced courses for the secondary kids. So it's just an example of what Julia was talking about in terms of the importance of language, and how, to what Marcia was saying last night, a little about how you can have policies and in place, but if the procedures don't match and then the implementation doesn't match it, then you're still all askew.
That's right. And I think the regulatory language that often follows from the legislative conversations is in many cases equally, if not more important, to the implementation strategies and the way it lands in communities for kids. I want to be mindful of the chat here, and maybe just Julia, come back to, you had a couple of questions that had some interest in hearing a little bit more about the primary talent pool, and particularly sort of the identification and selection process for individuals to get into that pool. I don't know if you have a little bit more you could share there, but certainly want to get to that question in real time.
We're very careful to not identify, but to select for the primary talent pool, because then parents think their child automatically will be identified at the end of 3rd grade. So very broad criteria are used, and it is for including, not for excluding anyone. And there's no magic number that has to be selected, but rather we hope at least a quarter of the students would have that opportunity to work in the primary talent pool. And in best practice, you would have your special teachers providing services. You would have the librarian involved in providing services. It would be something that various educators within the school would work with these children to enhance the opportunity for them to soar.
And so that selection is done at the school level.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. No, that's great. Well, I appreciate those examples, and I think they're really impactful as sort of the, and particularly the point of thinking about, we often talk about the statutory language is one thing and regulatory is another, and I think there needs to be vigilance in both places. Again, particularly in areas that require both legislative and regulatory responses by individuals who may or may not have an acute understanding about how the specific wording of, Shelagh, your example, can make a large impact in the ability of districts to do things, either be permitted or restricted from taking on those things. So, this is a little bit of I have a couple other questions, but I always love the magic wand and kind of pie in this, if you could wave the magic wand and do something, regardless of any of the barriers around things, we wanted to reflect a little bit on designing a piece of legislation, thinking about increasing educational equity for gifted and talented students. What would be contained in that magic piece of legislation, and why do you select that as sort of the thing to focus on with your magic powers, as opposed to the many other things that you could? And I think that might lend itself to a robust conversation. So Shelagh, I might start with you on this one, and we'll come to Julie.
You may be sorry because I had a lot of fun with this one.
That's great. Yeah, I love it.
I went big because I'm tired of messing around. So I have my pie in the sky legislation, which is federal legislation, a mandate to create a systemic solution on equity and gifted education. And this is sort of a Marland reboot plus. So what I'd like to do is to have 6 points in my legislation, in particular, planning conferences for states and districts to create plans to integrate into their service plans for gifted, but specifically dealing with children of color and children in poverty. I want universal pre-service preparation in gifted education for administrators and teachers, including culturally responsive instruction. If we did this one thing, think about what we would change. It would improve teacher referrals because the gatekeepers would know what they were doing. It would make us friends and build the field. It would combat myths being passed around currently in pre-service training programs. It would shift from the deficit perspective that Scott was talking about last night. It would be more likely to integrate gifted education into general education. And it seems that people want this, so it would be popular. Then incentives for early childhood gifted education programs in low-income areas, because Julie is right, that's where it needs to happen. Incentives for HBCUs to become more involved in gifted education. North Carolina has 12 HBCUs, only one has gifted licensure on the books, and they don't offer it unless you bring a cohort to them. And then we need curriculum by and about gifted people of color and gifted people in poverty, with a national dissemination model that is independent of publishers. So I can explain more of that if you want, but I'll let Julia chime in.
The thing I'll say, so I love that you went big on this. This is great. It also gives us a chance to come back to sort of the questions about federalism within this particular issue of education policy. And I do want to come back to sort of the relationship between federal policy and state, and then certainly district work as well. And also, you don't have to put a financial rider on this, so that's great. We don't have to worry about how much it costs or who would pay for it, although you may have ideas on that one.
You know, the IDEA was funded at $13.5 billion in 2019. So I would be okay with starting with half of that.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Sheila, for that. It's great. We'll come back to a couple of things here. So, Julie, I don't know what where your magic wand will take us, but I'm interested to hear some of your thoughts, and we can explore that piece as well.
Well, I kind of went the all-inclusive route too, that it's just not one piece of legislation that would take care of it. So much legislation would be beneficial to advanced learners. Data that we have that relates to the excellence gap tells us that we certainly have underrepresented students in advanced learning, but we don't have enough advanced learners if you're looking at all of the learners. So what do we need to get the message in the schools that continuous progress is what schools are about, not rising to proficiency? Because we know that messaging makes such a difference in the schools. We need legislation. The Higher Education Opportunities Act is being reauthorized, or at least they're talking about it now. As Sheila said, if we could get in the Higher Education Opportunity Act as it was the last time, but with some teeth to it so that it was enforced, that there was muscle there. We need acceleration policies from the time children enter school. They need to be learning at levels at which they're ready to learn. We need an accountability system in states that will reward students who are making growth and not stopping at the proficient level. There ought to be incentives for schools that are showing that achievement is at the highest levels. We need the primary talent pool. We need all of these pieces of legislation so that young children enter the school and have every opportunity to develop their talents, that they progress through the schools at a pace at which they're ready to learn, and that advanced learning opportunities are available to them on an ongoing basis, K through 12. And then we need teachers. And that's what the Higher Education Opportunities Act should do, who are ready to not only recognize talent, but they have strategies to ensure that all children are making continuous progress.
Yeah, thank you, Julie, for that. And I do want to, so I joke about HA reauthorization conversations. I was saying at a conference several months ago, I've owned 2 houses and had 2 children since we've been talking about we're always one session away from reauthorizing the Higher Education Opportunities Act. So every cycle, this is the one, and we'll see if this particular Congress can make some improvements on that. But it does bring up a question I did want to come back to in thinking about the relationship between sort of federal policy and framing, state actions, legislative and regulatory both, and then obviously the intersection with district and school level policy. From my sort of national vantage point and hearing different governor's offices in particular and legislative staff talk about this issue, it seems like there's not a broad consensus about exactly sort of where the right pass-off points and what the strategic alignment is between what's the right role for federal legislation in this place versus state and district. So I'm kind of just curious to get kind of your thoughts. And Sheila, I was particularly interested, you went with a magic wand federal solution. There's certainly some benefits, to that, I think. But just sort of, what are some of your thoughts about, are there specific things that the federal government and then the state's governments are probably best equipped to be addressing? And how do we advance that conversation and understanding, particularly among most folks in the states who are struggling, I think, to get up to speed adequately on understanding their own state's posture, let alone the relationship between their state's posture and what's both provided for either as options or requirements through federal statutory action. So just anything about the federalism play here, I think it's an interesting question in the gifted education sphere for sure.
I think it is too, and I know that it's a controversial position to go strongly for federal, but you look at the IDEA and the impact that's had nationwide on the stability of programs across the country. I think that that's really crucial. We have been a patchwork quilt in gifted education ever since its inception. So I think that one of the things that federal legislation can do is establish infrastructure. And I think that that's crucially important for us, that every state in the nation ought to have a program. The program doesn't have to look identical from state to state, but there are certain components that parents and children should be able to rely upon, especially in a highly mobile society. So I think that's really important. I think the federal government can incentivize. And I think we've seen that done very successfully, not only with the IDEA, but also with some of the opportunity zones and things like that they've provided over the years. And then you just look at, and again, the IDEA is the perfect parallel, all of the components that have gone into that. It's not just the programming for kids, it's professional learning opportunities. It's also technical assistance programs. It's also higher education to support research and development. So it's so omnibus in its superstructure that it seems to me that now is the time for us to go for that, so that we don't rely on the next superintendent to provide us with programs, and we don't fall apart when the next principal leaves the building or the next teacher leaves the classroom. It's, you can count on having gifted education regardless of who's sitting in what chair.
That's right. And Julie, I see you nodding along to some of those. You have some thoughts in that space too.
Well, many of us are in states where gifted children constitute a category of exceptional children. And so all of the law and none of the money comes along with that. Gifted children are exceptional children. And if that could be recognized at the federal level, it would be absolutely marvelous. The other thing that happens at the federal level is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And when you were talking about the Higher Education Act being about to be reauthorized for so long, well, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act hung in there for many, many years. And the biggest problem we have with the ESSA is with the regulation. The language within the legislation is wonderful for gifted. The regulation left out most of that language.
That's right. And I think that particularly in the federal negotiated rulemaking process is not the most transparent and accessible for the average advocate of the space. And so I think that just makes the point we're making earlier on the state side of sort of due diligence of, legislation, passage of legislation is typically the beginning of the process, but I think far too often we sometimes frame it as the end result we're driving towards. So I appreciate that. I think, just as a reflection, a little bit about, we've talked about the kind of three key areas that typically are brought forward to us with questions that people have about this. So we've talked a little bit about identification, although there's probably some more work there. Funding and accountability are sort of the other two. And one thing that we haven't touched on that I want to just take a little bit of time here before we go to a few of the questions that are popping up here from our attendees is this question of sort of in-states assessment and accountability regimes. The treatment, the disparate treatment we've seen across states in how gifted students are either tagged or tracked through those systems. And the reality that most of our policymaking in education is driven towards getting to proficiency. And you mentioned that word a couple of times, but just as you've engaged with policymakers at various levels in these conversations about accountability for programs, gifted programs, and how you've had success or faced some challenges in helping people think about accountability, not just as getting to proficiency for as many students within the state as possible, but also, how we think about the proficiency for each individual student is different. And for gifted students in particular, the responsibilities we have to make sure they're progressing at the rate we would expect given where they start, and not just sort of being less attuned to the needs of those students just because they may start at a place that a state accountability system says we don't need to pay attention to. So that's an area where I think we haven't touched on a little bit that I did want to get to, and go to either one of you or both for some thoughts about that, but sort of the interplay of accountability systems and gifted education in particular.
In North Carolina, we've gone to an accountability system where instead of how many kids have reached proficiency, the question is, has the child made a year's growth? So every child, regardless of where they start, has to demonstrate a year's growth by the end of the year. That's much better than the proficiency. It raises a whole nother set of questions. What is a year's growth for a gifted child? What is reasonable, what is exceptional, and what is inadequate? So, there are no easy solutions to this, but I think it's a better place to be, to say every child has to show a year of growth somehow.
We actually have something very similar to that, but I would say many administrators are pretty stuck in the message of getting kids up to grade level, which is what proficient is. And as long as that message is loudly heard, that's what teachers spend most of their time doing. And when that's the case, children who are ready to learn at higher levels really get squashed.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that and for this discussion. And Joy, I think in the moderator role here, I see a number of questions that have been coming up here, and I wondered if we might start some time to have those shared with us, and we can address those in turn if that works.
Absolutely. Let's start with the question from Karen Arnstein. Thank you for addressing these issues, but the best policy that meets the needs of students does not align with the funding needs of districts. Some districts in California seem resentful of parents who advocate for acceleration because it comes down to loss of funding. What are your thoughts to counter this argument?
Nice. So they start us with a softball here. It's a real softball question, but this gets back to, I think, where we started with, ultimately policy conversations about, applying scarce resources, across a more need than we have ability to address. And I think this question about, we have limited dollars, where do we spend those dollars? And this lends into the conversation we just had about proficiency, that oftentimes the default assumption is additional funding dollars should go to sort of raise the floor of base performance. How do you engage in those conversations, or have in the past, to sort of make the opposite case of that? If either of you wants to take that question on.
Well, let me start with that. Acceleration comes in many forms. I think A Nation Empowered has 20. Those don't cost anything, or at least most of them don't have a price tag that goes along with them. So is the acceleration grade level acceleration, and the child isn't in school that many years? I'm not in a situation that I've seen that be a problem. There have been so few children that have grade skipped, certainly not multiple times, for that to be a problem. But I'm sure for the person who asked this question, it is a real thing.
It does sort of suggest that you've got hordes of children accelerating, so many that it's going to impact the bottom line of a school budget, which I do think is really unlikely.
Yeah.
Well, this speaks to the challenges sometimes of legislating by anecdote, or responding by, we'll have a legislator that will hear from a particular, 5 or 6 kids, and then we come with this in a problem. I do think it's not, but there are very real sort of structural funding impediments to some of these changes at scale that can cause people to imagine a state at which we would have a budgetary shortfall because of these things. We faced similar dialogues around dual enrollment programs and acceleration in post-secondary learning opportunities, where we see, high schools concerned about sort of losing FTE funding for students that go other places. There are policy workarounds. We can talk about that, but I think it is a challenge to sort of get our arms around how big of a problem, is this in a particular school or a particular district, and then compared to the district-wide budget, is it truly going to be impactful or not? But it certainly is important for the conversations that have at that individual level. So thank you for the question. Is there another one we want to take on?
Here's a question from Melinda. What are the foundational start points if your state or country does not currently have legislation in gifted education, resources, or services?
So where would you start if you were starting with not much? Yeah.
I would start with going back to my original presentation with points of convergence, right? Where you're going to get a win-win out of the situation. So teacher preparation, a rising tide lifts all boats. Who doesn't want their kid's teacher to have training in gifted education? That should be good for everybody. So I think that's a natural starting place. Everything else can go from there. And then, currently in the United States, I do think that providing services in low-income areas and showing how you're doing economic good and social justice at the same time, and it's not automatically being perceived as a threat or inequitable.
Do you have anything you want to add on this one? Yeah.
Back in the early 80s, Kentucky started by having an endorsement for gifted education to get some teachers prepared before programming started. And another pretty basic step is to have some definition of who are the children who would be included as gifted and talented. And those are the basics. The kids, what do they need? And are the teachers ready to work with them?
I also think it's really important to cultivate the pool of friends outside of gifted education in the community who will speak to the need for gifted education. And that sort of goes back to the special conference where we invited the after-school program and we invited the early childhood educators and we talked to them about inequity in gifted education. And they came away saying, thank you so much. We've been waiting for somebody to have this conversation. Now we have all sorts of friends in all sorts of disciplines who are ready to go to bat with us. And, they can help persuade. And I think it's crucially important for us to have friends outside of gifted education speaking in our behalf.
Yeah. So starting with, building the bench of advocacy supporters for the issue outside of just the discipline, thinking about identification strategies so you have a sense of who are the students you need to serve, and then thinking intentionally about the construction of the right teacher labor force to support those students. I think all three of those are great suggestions as places to start. I have a few more questions. This is great.
Here's another question from Pamela Klinkenbeard. What do the panelists and moderator think is the role of the Federal Department of Ed in this discussion? How can we influence the department and the secretary, assuming he makes it past the Senate?
Well, I've done a little inquiring, not being a Connecticut person, but I've been inquiring as to what his interests are. And he's apparently very interested in the achievement gap. He's very interested, he came from the housing authority. So he, I'm sure, has experience living in an area where he and probably many others didn't have as much income. He would have qualified probably for free and reduced lunch. So putting all of this together, I have a letter ready to send to him, encouraging him to look at the excellence gap, because it is really addressing achievement, the gap he's interested in, but also the various groups who need lots of support in order to get rid of the excellence gap. So that's one way I think that we could get his interest, but I think that would be a great thing for lots of folks to do.
Brian, actually, this sounds more like it's your bailiwick. What would you do? What do you think?
So this turning around on the moderator. I'm losing control of the panel. No, that's great. So I think the suggestions that we've talked about, are germane here. So, one is I do think that sort of nesting the role of the policy priorities, that the gifted and talented community has within the broader themes and conversations that, demonstrated here by the suggestion of, when we talk about opportunity gaps, there's a part of this, there's an excellence gap that is a component of something that we're sort of already on record as caring about. I think rather than trying to sort of recreate the habits of mind to say, this is another top tier issue you have to care about, here are the things you already care about and how what I'm talking to you about can advance that agenda. I think that nesting of this particular issue under some others is really, really important. I also think in engaging, particularly a new administration that's coming in with new staff. So there's sort of who's in the lead of the department. But I think the key appointments that are coming, political appointments that will come for the individuals within the department that have direct programmatic responsibility for some of the current existing funding streams, whether it's through IDA or, higher ed programs or others, I think those are individuals that are also really critical to engage. And I would particularly say as an example, Sheila, engaging them around things like, teacher preparation pipelines at HBCUs is a topic that is going to get a lot more attention this February than it has gotten any of the prior Februaries over the last 4 years. And so thinking again, how a part of that federal effort that is probably coming to utilize our MSI community more for teacher preparation, because we've done a good job over the last several years, I think, convincing policymakers that when students have teachers that look like them, they have different types of outcomes. That's really important. People are into that. Okay, so some of the students that look like these teachers we're trying to cultivate have gifted needs, and we need to make sure those teachers are prepared. I think talking about case making that way is really, really important. And then I would say the earlier the better you can get your name in the door as somebody with a resource. As you can imagine, the business cards flow fast and furious for new appointees. And at some point, there's a lot of noise there, but I think it's to be early and to be clear about what your ask is, but to nest that ask underneath things that people are already on record as caring about, I think is a really good strategy. I'll be mindful of time, but I think we do probably have time for maybe one or two more questions from our participants, if that's.
I think we can squeeze in two. Let's go with.
Perfect.
Which current Colorado and federal legislators are most supportive of equitable education / gifted education? Are any of you running for office?
I think that's a question for Norma.
Right. I will, for given my role, I'll punt on commenting on any particular individual legislators within the state here. I will say just in terms of, I think one of the challenges is thinking about most of the policy priorities that get expressed, whether it's by governors and candidates. I think one example is you can go back to, but this is probably not the first bullet. When people say I'm running as an education legislator, I'm the education governor, there's a whole bunch of things they mean. So some of it is, it's a little hard to unearth that. I mean, I know we had a couple of federal offices that were invited initially to potentially participate, in the panel. So I know that Senator Booker's long been, a champion of some of the things that we've been talking about. So that might be one example at the federal level. We have some comments here around, Senator Murray, the current Senate Education Chair, and it feels like there's been some traction maybe with some of the staff there. But as we have, I talked about the legislative calendar and the turnover that happens, every every 2 years at least in state houses. Oftentimes I think because of the framework of political polarization that we look through, people assume there's not a lot of change because the color of the map stays the same. And I say this all the time, like, Oklahoma's red like it was last legislative cycle, but the people in the Oklahoma legislature are different. And so I think we have to continue to sort of re-educate individuals, but also to answer this question, now's the time to begin to see what are committee assignments, what are the things people are interested in as co-sponsors. We're starting to get into a place where people will reveal those preferences, but I don't know if either you have additional thoughts on specific individuals in different states, but so that would be my generic response.
In the U.S. Senate, Senator Grassley has been the main supporter, or he's helped with the Javits funding for as long as we've had it, but he's retiring. So the time comes that there's a shift in leadership, and that shift is soon to occur.
I would like to ask one more question, and then we'll move to our poster session. This question comes from Paul Visconta. How would each of the speakers approach the opposite of enacting, rescinding legislation? For example, in some areas, acceleration is specifically prohibited. Should rescinding be a separate goal or approached through positive legislation as a line item in proactive legislative work? Is rescinding legislation harder on its own?
Well, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, maybe I'll take that generically, Julia, to start, and then you can fill in some specifics. So I do think it is harder, to wholesale rescind statutory language in particular than it is to figure out how to amend or adjust it through regulatory revisitation of implementation rules. I think that you can have a de facto rescindance of statutory language by proactively passing another piece of statutory language, which is usually how states handle these things. Very, very rarely do we see like a clean vote on rescinding a piece of statutory language. So I do think it's typically done, through an amendment of a piece of legislation that will move, or oftentimes, and I think, Sheila, your example of some of what happened in North Carolina between statutory language and regulatory implementation language, I think that process of change or adjustment, maybe not rescindment, is probably more technically complicated, but more common and easier, if that's the right way to think about it, than statutory change. But Sheila, I'll turn to you.
No, what you said, I think that's just right. Julia, go ahead.
No, I think it's just right too.
Okay.
And I'm trying to land this plane exactly when they told us our arrival time was, and I try to be respectful of the planning. So let me say to both of you, thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this conversation. And just as a personal aside, thank you for your work in this space. It's really meaningful to people that care so much and lending your talents and time to today's panel. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And
Brian.
thank you, Norma.